I can't believe how badly this turned out. My friends called me dramatic, but this was the first page I coloured in my brand new book, Messages to My Younger Self, and I really wanted it to be good. And like, it's fine, but I already get so much hate for how I colour in my book. And you know when it's just not how you envisioned it turning out? I don't know if it's because I was doing it quite late and in a bit of a dark room. I was literally using my phone torch to film this video, but I just wasn't that happy with it. But I thought it is a good example to show you. Basically, I get so many questions and messages from people who say they don't believe me when I say that the ink doesn't bleed through to the next side of the page. Obviously, my books are double-sided, but the paper's made out of really thick recycled paper, so the ink doesn't bleed through, it's fine. But people never believe me, so I thought I'd show you. Look, I'm going over and over it with dark colours, black, voila, ignore my awful colouring, but there is no bleed through at all. There you go. I hope you believe me now. Any water-based markers are completely fine and
I was always taught to color within the lines. Fuck the lines.
Tripping off the beat kinda, dripping off the meat grinder, heat niner, pimping, stripping, fork, sweet mind.
Hey everybody, I'm back to color for you. I found this at the dollar store. It's a color by number coloring book, which was my absolute favorite growing up, the color by numbers. Each little number is a tiny circle, so instead of just circling every single circle, I outlined where all the specific numbers were and then colored the outline in. It was a whole lot faster, it makes it look a whole lot neater, so that was just my strategy for this one. So this is just me coloring it in. I'm sorry for the downward angle. I'm trying to get better at the filming part of this for you guys, but this was actually really fun to do. It was really satisfying, calmed me down, stress reliever, and it turned out to be a clownfish.
So I've been using alcohol markers for so long now that I forgot how regular markers work. So when I found this pack of old markers in my basement, I thought I'd give it a try. The first thing I noticed was how much they saturate the paper. Like, you go over it a couple of times and it's just totally saturated. It's really hard to get an even layer. It ends up kind of blotchy. And to be honest, I didn't even really notice the difference between alcohol markers and regular markers until I went back to regular markers. Something I noticed that was really interesting is that regular markers saturate the paper, but they don't actually bleed through the paper as much as alcohol markers do. So out of all these markers, I only had one marker that was actually an alcohol marker, and that's the one that bled through the paper. But it's also the one that gave me the most even, beautiful tone across the entire thing. And you'll see it here with this flower. This is the only alcohol marker in the whole bunch, and it, even though I'm going over it several times, it still gives a really even color. I also noticed with the regular markers that I didn't have as much control. I went over the lines a little bit more than I normally would. Now, I don't know if that would be the same with all regular markers or if it's just this type of tip, but the tips were just, you can see it here, the tips are just very floppy, and I found it really hard to control, so I had to go over and had to be very gentle with my markers. But the cool thing was I discovered on the other side there was this tiny little tip that I could use for little details, which with the alcohol markers that I have, I don't have that much control with the tiny tip. But if you go over the paper, and you can see that here, if you go over it quite a bit, it kind of rips up the paper a little bit, so that I don't really like. Here I'm finishing up the lips, which is my favorite part, and again, I didn't have a lot of control with this marker, so I went over the line a little bit, but I fixed it in the end. If you like this Day of the Dead coloring book, you can find it at the link